Chatter. I'm 412 and on, and I am joined today by my good friend Breaking Spectre to bring you another episode of Zooming In. This one is going to be very much focused on the world of finance, and it is called You Are Witnessing, Watching the Systematic Destruction of the Old Guard. Breaking Spectre, how are we doing today?
Doing good. Busy with Q dropping today too, by the way.
Yeah, lots of good stuff coming out of the queue, and we might have some time to touch on that towards the end.
Yep.
But up until then, it's all yours, man. Take it away.
All right. Well, like 412 said, this one we're going to call You Are Witnessing, Watching the Systematic Destruction of the Old Guard. And I don't think people quite realize what all that entails. In that, we've watched through Q posts. We're talking about the FBI, the Clown Network, all that, and all the resignations and departures and whatnot. But I think there's a whole lot more to that. And when we get to the very end here and talk about some of the posts that have come through today, specifically Q Post 2575, there's a whole lot that's going on with this. And I think this is a big part of it. We've got these pillars that have been built in society, and over the last 6, 8, 10 years, we've watched media get rolled up from 25, 30 outfits into 5 or 6. Banksters, the same thing. The government, autos, big pharma, and ag. You got the FANG stocks. It's just a consolidation of power into the few. And so that's what I want to try and touch on here today. And today I think we'll first start off with GM. Now, GM, if you recall, has been in the news here in the last couple of weeks. I think it was right around the 26th. We saw some interesting stuff about them having some layoffs, right?
Yep.
But just to give you a little back history, GM obviously was a company founded in 1908 to consolidate several motor car companies, which consisted of Buick, Oldsmobile, Cadillac, Oakland, which became Pontiac, Ewing, Marquette, and others. And this stuff you can find directly off of like Britannica.com. I just lifted it off that if you want to go investigate. So there's just a little bit of history right there. And with that, we'll jump into what transpired here around the 26th. Now, starting off early in the morning, we saw a series of articles and tweets come through. First up, we had about 6:45 in the morning. GM to close a 100-year-old Oshawa plant affecting thousands of jobs, and that was on Zero Hedge. Furthering, about 9 o'clock in the morning, we saw GM to close 3 North American plants and production of slow-selling sedans as cost-cutting intensifies. Then we saw the union get aboard a little bit later on in the afternoon and say, union leader, GM won't close plants without a hell of a fight. And then that triggered Trump and says the country has done a lot for GM. So Trump had a little bit to say in not only that day, but in ensuing days. He was disappointed with GM and their CEO, Mary Barra, for closing plants in Ohio, Michigan, Maryland, nothing being closed in Mexico, China. The U.S. saved General Motors, and this is the thanks we get. We're now looking at cutting all GM subsidies. And he says if GM doesn't want to keep their jobs in the U.S., they should pay back the $11.2 billion bailout that was funded by the American taxpayer. Hold on to that number, by the way. We're going to come back to that $11.2 billion and see how the circle squares at the end.
I love the
Now,
way our POTUS just will remind people of these things. Like, by the way, like your tax dollars have greatly subsidized this company that's exporting his jobs overseas. Just so you all remember that, he's very, very masterful in the way he kind of just subtly reminds people of the inner workings of these deals.
I believe that is called Troller-in-Chief. Zero Hedge later on in that day says Trump, Mnuchin call for GM to pay back federal bailout. And we saw GM shares slide as Trump hits at car tariffs. And this was as of the 28th of November, mind you. So, again, highlighting some of the articles that ensued, not only that Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, but GM plant prepares to close. Trudeau says fighting climate change. This is Canada, obviously. And Trump also told agencies to find ways to cut GM subsidies, as I just mentioned. Another Zero Hedge article. Trump threatened, let's see here, move this guy out of the way. Trump threatens GM, laments no plant closures in China. And that was after they planned to lay off 15,000 workers and run counter to the president's promise to bring back U.S. manufacturing jobs, which he's been certainly lobbying for. Canada's auto industry at risk if GM closes Oshawa plant. Again, that was out of the union up there. And then we also saw thousands moved out for a new GM factory. Now it's closing. This was around the Detroit area, around the 26th. And Trump certainly was angry, tremendously disappointed with GM CEO Mary Barra. These are certainly business decisions. Just think it's a tremendous amount of disappointment. And we'll see how this pans out here. We'll take a look at Miss Barra here toward the end and see where her ideology is. So that being said, another article came out. This one was via Fox News. Says, get them while they're hot. GM is killing these 6 models. And so we started off and we see the Buick LaCrosse, I believe, was one of the first models. Then we got a pair of Cadillacs here, the CT6 and the XTS models. And then also on the Chevy side, we've got the Cobalt, the Impala, and we've also got the Volt. Now, the Volt is interesting because that was one of the first hybrid cars, part electric, part mechanical drive still. And it's interesting in that old Obama was certainly a cheerleader for it. And the GM's mass layoff includes eliminating a hybrid car he once championed. So GM is killing those products off. Now, let's walk this back a little bit because it's not like this was just suddenly sprung on us. There's a number of things that have led us up to this point. The first of which we can see out of the Epic Times here. GM offers buyouts to cut costs after strong quarterly profit, and that was around October 31st. So that was almost a full month before we see this little onslaught come on and say, hey, we're going to close all these plants. Also on the 31st, we saw their third quarter earnings per share around $1.87. Estimated it was $1.25, so the revenue beat estimates. And we also saw the shares gain 7.6% after third quarter earnings per share, beating estimates. That was around the 31st. So walking that back further, what got us to this point? Around the 28th of September, we saw that GM was bigger than Tesla again by way of market cap. Earlier in the month in September, boom, GM is said to report 13% U.S. auto sales drop, estimated down 7.7%. So that tells us right then and there that they've got too many cars sitting on a lot. They're not getting sold. So this is yet something else that led to what we just saw here in the past couple weeks. Now walking that back just a little bit further to July, GM sinks as much as 8.2%, most since 2015, and this could be the end of Einhorn. Now, Einhorn, obviously, for those that don't know, is on the hedge fund side, and those guys are heavily invested in a lot of these outfits. Also on the 25th, GM CFO Steven said GM has exposure to $1 billion in currency losses. Uh-oh. So 11.2 billion that Trump mentioned are losing money by way of currencies, and that as they sell overseas and everything else. Starting to add up here, talking some real money. Zero hedge back in June. GM warns auto tariffs would kill jobs, lead to smaller company. So that might have been an early signal. And we also saw that GM was to build a Blazer in Mexico despite Trump anger. And this was as Trump was talking tariffs even back then in mid-June. So you can kind of see how this thing kind of led up from about June to about November and where this was going to head for GM. It didn't look good. Now, one thing I do want to point out here is that GM certainly has been an advocate for the electric car industry. I'll say, how can that be if they just killed off the Chevy Volt, which is a hybrid? Well, I think, in my opinion, it's in order to try and directly compete against Tesla, for one, and number two, if you're paying attention by way of regulations, and I'll even throw in Agenda 21, smart cities and that, there is no room for fossil fuels. And I think this is certainly a part of that. And so one of the things we saw here is that GM wanted to have national electric vehicle mandate. And that was back on October 26th. And that neatly ties in with what we saw both on October 3rd and May 31st about them partnering with Honda for about $2.75 billion in terms of self-driving units. And then they also, if you remember right, had SoftBank invest $2.25 billion in driverless car units. So you can see where they're headed here. Basically trying to kill off gasoline engine, start migrating toward electric cars. So that's $5 billion right there that's getting invested in that business. And what do we say, 11.2 billion bailout? They've already lost $1 billion by way of currency losses, and here they've got a $5 billion investment. Keep those numbers in mind. Now, how in the world are they going to get from point A to B when, one, they have trouble enough with the products they've got on the road? They've had brake pump issues where they've had recalls now that you can see in the top article there. And then we saw even back in September, GM stock slide as automaker recalls 4 million vehicles over airbags. I don't remember if this is tied to the Tata airbags or not, but certainly they've had their share of woes with the current vehicles on the road with all sorts of recalls. And that's not even touching on the big one, which I'll get to here in a minute.
Okay.
So, that being said, you look at what's going on here, a couple things to note. First of which is car catastrophe. GM, Fiat, Chrysler idle 7 plants, over 10,000 workers, and that will be idled. So it's not just GM. We're seeing it across a lot of the car manufacturers. And then we saw November GM slashes 2,000 jobs, suspends third shift on bloated inventories. So again, it's just highlighting that cars are not moving off lots. There's a backlog of inventory. It's backing up. They're having to shut down. And that has been the case for quite a while. Now, if you remember back to 2008, when we had the Great Recession, if you want to call it that, TARP came about. And this was still under Bush before he left office. And at that time, if you recall, the big three automakers, Chrysler, General Motors, Ford, in order to prevent their collapse of the struggling auto industry, the plan made immediately available $13.4 billion in government loans from the Troubled Asset Relief Program. And this was approved by Congress to aid the financial industry following the subprime mortgage crisis. And also around that time, if you recall, GM had to file for Chapter 11, bankruptcy protection in June 2009. It emerged about a month later, and then in 2010, the company officially discontinued the Pontiac, Saturn brands and sold Saab, downsized considerably, and left us with Buick, Cadillac, Chevy, and GMC. And then in 2010, they returned to the stock market with one of the largest IPOs in U.S. history and regained its title as the largest automaker in the world. Again, you can find this on Britannica's website as some of their backstory. But in that time, mind you, as they rebounded, they faced a setback in 2014. Mary Barra had taken the helm at that point, was widely praised. GM posted strong earnings. But they also had the defective part with the faulty ignition switches, which caused 120 deaths. And that has kind of been a plague for quite a little while. So, and prior to that, going back through the archives here in April 2015, I happened to come across this article. It says government motors is a big black hole of dysfunction. People forget that prior to 2008 crash, people referred to GM as a healthcare company which just happened to make cars, and highlighting the pension crisis. So even back in 2015, they were highlighting that top management didn't have their stuff together and was probably making some bad decisions. And so I've got to believe that that has likely snowballed, at least to this point. And just to highlight what 2008 was, for those that don't know, that little blip you see up there in the top right in that gray bar represents what actually caused our Great Recession, which was basically the equivalent of a slowing credit expansion that nearly collapsed the global financial system. And that's what caused all of our troubles. This is out of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System that Charles Hugh Smith highlights from March 2018. And so that was the little flap that caused job losses and everything else. Basically, they couldn't access credit. So that being said, of course, another article was highlighted here. Let's see, for whatever reason, that's not popping back up here. Anyway, article that Michael Snyder highlighted here recently was talking about the come to me here in a second. Talking about the stock buybacks. There we go. Anyway, what this article highlights, both GE and GM have both been in the news. GE is on the ropes as well, but there's some interesting quips that came out of this particular article that I highlighted there on the right. In order for GM to do what they're going to have to do and lay these people off, they're going to have to borrow $3.8 billion just to close these plants and lay the workers off. The article goes on to highlight Mary Barra should have never been made CEO of General Motors, and now the world is getting to see why. And I think I've kind of laid the groundwork ahead of that, kind of highlighting that. Bob Lutz highlights, nowadays GM looks at the hard reality, says we've got a demand problem on cars, which we've highlighted with inventory buildup. What are we going to do about it? We have to shut some facilities, move production to truck plants. And that was via CNBC's halftime report. And if General Motors had been much wiser with their money, they wouldn't have to initiate a restructuring so quickly. And over the past 4 years, General Motors spent a staggering $13.9 billion on stock buybacks. And these stock buybacks are a massive Ponzi scheme. And it basically highlights that basically the top brass at GM should be fired. And again, highlight what Trump said about 11.2, and I don't know if the number is square with the 13.9, but let's say they're on par. Basically, they got a bailout for $11 billion that flowed through and basically went straight to the pockets of the top brass, is kind of one way I would look at it.
Isn't that wonderful how that works? They act irresponsibly. They do a horrible job managing their institutions, and then when the shit hits the fan, who's there to foot the bill and clean it up? The working people. It's ridiculous.
So highlighting a little bit more about stock buybacks, and this dates in 2015 as well. For every job created in the U.S. this decade, U.S. corporations spent almost $300,000 on stock buybacks. And there's old former Federal Reserve Chair Ben Bernanke that was on the cover of the Atlantic. The hero. Yeah, right.
Wow.
So a little further color on stock buybacks, and this comes by way of Ralph Nader, how CEO stock buybacks parasitize the economy, and that was October 2017. He highlighted this. And there's some good quips out of this article. It says the monster of economic waste, over $7 trillion of dictated stock buybacks since '03 by the self-enriching CEOs of large corporations, started with a little noticed change in 1982 by the SEC under President Ronald Reagan. That was when the SEC chairman, John Shad, a former Wall Street CEO, redefined unlawful, quote, stock manipulation to exclude stock buybacks. Keep that in mind, because that is something that happened back in the early 80s that has gotten us to this point. Now, presently, hordes of corporate lobbyists are descending on Washington to demand deregulation and tax cuts. Why, you ask them? In order to conserve corporate money for investing in economic growth, they assert. Really? Why then are they turning around and wasting far more money on stock buybacks, which produce no tangible value? The answer is clear. It's uncontrolled executive greed. More shenanigans, low interest rates that are deductible. Companies actually borrow money to finance their stock buybacks. This is how ridiculous it is. If the stock market tanks, these companies will have a self-created debt load to handle. And as Citigroup executive Richard Parsons expressed worry about a massively manipulated stock market, which scares the crap out of him. And it also goes on to state, when managers can't create value in the business other than buying their own stock, it seems like it's time for a management change. And,
yeah.
and essentially burning trillions of dollars for the hyper-enrichment of radical corporate state supremacists wasn't what classical capitalism was supposed to be about. So what we're highlighting here, folks, is the fact that is troubling is that it's executive greed, mismanagement of dollars, the flow through of dollars from the government to corporations, which blurs the line between public and private sector. And one might argue whether or not GM is even still technically on the private side, given the blurred line. I think that is the very definition of fascism, is it not?
Yep, that's exactly the definition of fascism.
So, in any case, another article here highlighted that just came through on the 29th. As the tide goes out, UTX faces reality while other companies follow suit. Now, this one highlights another example. They use ConocoPhillips as kind of a missive, I guess. One of 6 articles they've written. This is by way of Lance Roberts at Real Investment Advice. Describes how COP was forced to cut a reliable dividend and capital expenditures as they were strapped for cash. The price of oil at that time was hurting cash flows. Unfortunately, Conoco, like GE, had previously bought back a significant number of shares, which greatly reduced their liquidity status when it was needed most. And while this article is nearly 3 years old, it's every bit as important today as it was then. It exemplifies how precarious a company's ability to survive financial weakness and or an economic downturn is when capital is squandered in efforts to temporarily boost share prices. And we're going to see this story play out for the next few years as economic growth declines and stock prices fall. And the article goes on to state, basically, the rich get richer. And it finally concludes with, this article may be best summed up with the closing to our first article on buybacks. Fraud, noun, wrongful or criminal deception intended to result in financial or personal gain, which is exactly what we're seeing here today.
Yep.
That being said, at kind of a macro level, what's going on behind the scenes in the markets? This isn't just GM, mind you. This is kind of a round robin look at all corporations in terms of the maturity wall of bonds that are going to need to be refinanced over the next few years in the U.S. And that graph you see on the left from 2019 to 2021 is ever increasing. U.S. and European corporates are facing large amounts of debt redemption over the next 3 years. And you can see the types there. On the right, again, this is out of the Zero Hedge article that you see there at that link. Investment grade and high yield, US dollars, corporate maturity wall, same thing. So what happened is this. From 2008, when the stock market crashed, we had the Great Recession. What happened with the Fed? We had all sorts of quantitative easing. They went through 1, 2, 3, 4 rounds of that, which is basically expanding the money supply. And what they do in the meantime? They dropped the interest rates to basically 0. So it made it like it was free money, but it screwed over people like you and me who have anything either in our savings accounts because there's no interest on it, but it made it very favorable for corporations to borrow money, which we just highlighted, and invest. And basically, rather than reinvest in their business by way of R&D, for example, to build better products, improve the ones they got, they opted to pocket the change.
Of course.
Pretty sick.
Yeah.
So, aside from that, there's some other headwinds in the market, and I love this graphic that came through, I think probably October, November of last year. They do a great job of putting these visual things together here, and I want you to look right dead center of there where it says each square this size is worth 100 billion. And you can kind of read down the side as they go along here. And this highlights all the various types of financial instruments. I just want to do this to give you a little perspective of what we're talking here. You know, as much as we're talking billions in terms of what GM is faced with, and multiple billions with multiple corporations and the headwinds they got, take a look at this. So there you see silver, crypto, the biggest companies like Berkshire, Microsoft, Alphabet, Apple, etc. And again, each of those squares represents 100 billion.
Wow.
Flashing down, 50 richest people. And again, I've carried that graphic down just for perspective's sake. And there you see Gates, Bezos, Buffett, Zuckerberg, Ma, Musk, those guys on the side. We see state of California, the Federal Reserve balance sheet, $4.5 trillion from 2008 to 2014 by way of all the quantitative easing programs. We see the currencies, gold, the stock markets, and you can see how this continues to build. We're not talking billions anymore, we're in the trillions.
Yep.
Global money supply on what they call narrow versus broad adds more trillions of dollars. And global debt, we start getting into that. China debt as a percentage of GDP, how that's escalating. That's emerging markets. Then we get into global real estate, highlighting furthermore. And then we start getting into derivatives. Now, what are derivatives, you ask? It's a contract between two or more parties that derives its value from the performance of an underlying asset, index, or entity. And if you've ever watched the movie The Big Short, it's a great movie to watch to kind of wrap your mind around these side bets that go on. And the way I look at it is this: the further away you get from the truth, it kind of follows that saying, the same is exactly true here. The further you get away from gold to just the regular dollar, it's fiat currency, and you get into these machinations and derivatives and whatnot, you can quickly see how these things are going to go and what's going to happen when that stuff finally unwinds. So that's the derivative market. A little bit further down, keep in mind each of those squares represents 100 billion. A little bit further down. Now the best estimates say it's about 544 trillion, but there's others that say on the high end it's 1.2 quadrillion. They really don't have any idea. And we're still scrolling.
That's such an obscene amount of money.
Yeah, and that's the money project. But just for perspective's sake, that's all the derivatives on that particular chart. Just a ridiculous sum. And I did try to keep the little graphic with each square represent 100 billion off to the right there in perspective of just how small that is relative to that. So we've got some major headwinds ahead of us. Now, as much as I like Trump, as much as we've seen over the course of the lead up to the elections, he hyped the economy. One thing that is fact is that we're seeing these layoffs, and this tweet highlights that. GM at the top, Blue Apron, Bombardier, Reuters, Disney, Starbucks, NBC Universal, Cisco. All these companies are laying off people. Well, why? And I think we're going to see that here maybe towards the end that'll help put this in perspective. One thing about Trump is that and what we see in the market is there's a lot of optimism, a lot of hype, but it's not really tangible. When you start getting into, say, the fundamentals of the markets, like some of the graphs and things we just talked about, it seems we've got a little bit of a dichotomy. But like I said, I think you'll see here at the end where this is going to go. With that, another good article. This is the Everything Bubble and how it will end, which is basically what we're in. It highlights the crashes, from 1929, 87, Asia crisis, LTCM collapse, the tech bubble, the subprime meltdown, 2008 financial crisis, which now in 2018 we're dubbing this the Everything Bubble because everything is completely inflated. Asset prices, net, are ridiculous. Fed did all this to save the economy. In reality, it has created enormous and unprecedented economic distortions and misallocations of capital, and it's all going to be flushed out. There have certainly been warning signs. 1, emerging markets are flashing red. 2, unsustainable economic expansion. And number 3, we've been in the longest bull market yet. It goes on to highlight that the S&P 500's CAPE ratio, that cyclically adjusted price to earnings ratio, is now the second highest it's ever been. And usually when that ratio is high, stocks are more expensive. And usually it's only high right before, just like when the tech bubble burst. So we should expect this in the coming year or two, fairly soon, I would expect. So that being said, here's GM's top offices. You know, they've got 18 executives between VPs, executive VPs. Mary Barra, you see up there in the top left. And as we walked through and talking about stock buybacks, we said these people shouldn't even be in the positions we're in based on the decisions made and the money losses.
Right.
And Trump seems to agree. Now, Mary Barra, well, I'll walk through those guys first. There's the first 9 that you see there. Mary Barra on the left, certainly. And we've got quite an eclectic bunch. Mary Barra, just to give you a little flavor on where she's coming from, she is certainly a Davos woman. Been to the World Economic Forum a time or two, and there you see her partnered up with Sheryl Sandberg talking about gender stereotypes. Outdated gender norms are really doing harm. Well, that's interesting.
Hmm.
And a couple other
Very
things.
progressive.
Well, what I'm trying to highlight here is some of the ideological things that these companies have, right? That are probably also working against Trump. And I would probably classify her as probably a never Trumper, if you were to look at it in that aspect.
Right.
But certainly Trump never went to Davos. Yes, he had some representatives there, I think. But she has been an integral part of that for the last couple of years, 2015, 2016, both. So that just gives you a little idea where her perspective is. True globalist. And there's the rest of the top brass right there, which in my mind is a pretty good representation of what the old diversity and inclusion looks like. That's foisted upon us via government mandates. And I think GM certainly is very representative of that. Now, in the interest of time, obviously, I would love to have spent time, doing a deeper dive on these folks just to see how the circle squares on this. If you recall here, a year and a half or so ago, we had the Panama Papers come out. I would love to have the opportunity to go in and take a look and see whether or not some of these folks are on that list and how their dollars have been offshored, and whether or not the Paradise Papers and Open Secrets both, put together a nice little list of just where their dollars have gone as a result of $11 billion flowing right into their pockets by way of incentives and all that good stuff that they have with their executive packages. So it might be an interesting deep dive later on. What I think is it boils down to this. At the end of the day, it's an ideological fight. I think we're going to see some old institutions fall in favor of new institutions that'll rise. And if you remember right back in the day, it used to be see the USA in your Chevrolet, all about freedom, getting out on the open road, versus where are we headed today? And this is Agenda 2030. And look at all the interconnectedness, especially looking at automobiles through sensors embedded in roadways, streetlights. Real-time transit traffic can be managed for the purpose of reducing travel time and fuel efficiencies. And of course, they'll try and paint that in a good light.
Mm-hmm.
But what does this really highlight? Smart cities.
Yep.
They don't want you to travel. The days of you getting out on the open road and seeing the USA in your Chevrolet, long gone. But with that, I say this, that's purely a choice, because at the end of the day, we have the buying power, they don't. And so I think, quite honestly, it's up to us to decide the course. Why should we allow ourselves to have this technology foisted upon us when we have free energy alternatives out there? We have HHO generators that could be easily used, Tesla technologies, that sort of stuff. I think at the end of the day, GM is going to go by the wayside, frankly.
Oh, good riddance.
So that brings us to this point. A good article that was updated on October 13th via Quora. And it says, what do you think Trump said to Kennedy that made him stop in his tracks like that? Well, that's an interesting way to spin off of talking about GM. Well, here's where this goes. Now, coming off of 41's funeral just last week, keep in mind what he was, what he represented, and where his family was. This article highlights Prescott Bush was the head of Union Bank Corp. And Brown Brothers Harriman, New York City. He and his fellow investment bankers crept into Germany after World War I, as the conditions were perfect for taking advantage of a broken nation and a starving people to rein in a time of right-wing socialism throughout Europe. They invested in the Nazi manufacturing giant IG Farben, whose factories and camps were built for. And Professor Anthony Suttonen details those who participated as well. There on the right is a quip out of his book that highlights Morgan, Rockefeller, General Electric, Standard Oil, National City Bank, Chase, and Manhattan banks. Kuhn, Loeb and Company, General Motors, Ford, and other industrialists all helped to finance the Nazis. And to prove this point, he provided the bank statements, letters from U.S. ambassadors, mainstream media sources, congressional records, excerpts from congressional investigations, and statements from the Nuremberg trials. So GM certainly was a part of that. And at this point, that these institutions that likely helped fund the Nazi regimes back then are probably going to fall pretty hard. And I think this is part of the plan, frankly.
Yeah.
And when Q says, at the end of the day, you're witnessing the destruction of the old guard, I think, like I said, it refers to more than just the FBI folks we've seen. I think it refers to a lot of these institutions that have built themselves up are now going to come crumbling down.
Yeah, and Q has also told us to look at the history of World War II and World War I, for that matter. And I think this is part of the reason why is that a lot of the American companies that funded both sides of the war are still playing a nefarious role today. And like you said, they are going to be taken down.
Yeah, and to that point, the Atlantic councils and all these think tanks, and all you have to do is go out to some of these think tanks and look and see who major contributors are, and you'll see a lot of these institutions, donate $1 million here, 10 million there. You see which way they lean and ideologies that they want to try and foist upon the populace, and it's not good. And every one of these, I'm sure Trump is well aware of, Q alike. I don't think it plays well for the whole Make America Great Again, unless they do an about face. And that being said, of course, for those who might question this, obviously, there's things in the work behind the scenes. Obviously, December 21st of last year, we had the executive order blocking the property of persons involved in serious human rights abuse or corruption. And on the day of, who did we see resign?
Eric Schmidt.
Yeah, Google, of course. And as of end of November here, the sealed indictments has been updated to reflect about 66,500 and change. And I think at the time that I pulled the resignation information, I think there's about 5,800 and change resignations. So wow. Things are moving. Things are moving. But if you want to bridge the gap, I'd say take a look at our friend in the Matrix here, a friend of the channel here's piece here he did with War Drummer, about an hour and 45-minute piece where he gets into the really deep side of this and where that money likely flows. I think I can take you partway down as I've shown you here, and maybe there's a bridge in between somewhere. It may still need to be investigated, but what him and War Drummer have done is on par with taking it to the level of the trusts and that have been built in the background.
Yeah, definitely. If you haven't had a chance to check that out, it's fantastic. That video with War Drummer in the Matrix, really, really well done. I hope they do a follow up and expand some more, because I know in the Matrix there's a lot more to share.
Sure. And with that, I'll leave you with the latest updated map. Certainly many of us who follow Q have seen the original map and are where some of this goes. I just throw this here to highlight all the various connections behind the scenes that these folks are tied to and where this leads. So Q tells us to follow the map. This is another version of that map. And that's what I've got for today. Like I said, I opted to focus on GM just for the simple fact they've been in the news here in the last couple weeks. Would like to think that we could use this as kind of a template for future ones going forward. For if we dig into Monsanto and Bayer, uh, 1MDB, and the whole uh, Goldman Sachs stuff, media companies, Facebook, you name it. So stay tuned with us on this one because we're going to leverage this one to the hilt, and we'll watch the pillars crumble.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's tie it all together with a Q post here at the end.
Sure.
Um, so I'm going to steal your screen share and just bring this up here. Um, we have Q post 2575 that literally dropped about an hour or so ago, and Q says the plan to have the Fed raise rates steep incline beginning in March of 2019 in an effort to kill the economy prior to the 2020 presidential election is known and planned for. Structure change coming? Q. To me, this is huge because at the heart of all of these financial shenanigans is the Federal Reserve and just the central banking, fractional reserve banking practices in general. And to hear President Trump, talk about auditing the Fed and QAnon, who many of us see as an extension of President Trump, talking about the Federal Reserve and reeling them in and restructuring or eliminating them, however you want to look at it, is just huge. It really does show that the old guard is falling, and we're gonna take our country back and our monetary system back.
Right. Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, if you go back to 1913 or 1903, anyway, back to when the Federal Reserve was created, it was done in a dark of night, and the stuff has been in the dark until now. I mean, we can see glimpses of things that they do, their monetary policies, like the quantitative easing and that took place after 2008. Now they're going through a period of quantitative tightening, which is basically shrinking the money supply. But what that does for these corporations who got sucked into this free money is now it's going to cost them even more to service that debt that they took on. And it's going to reel them in. And if you look at ECB, for example, under Mario Draghi, for example, they've got all these zombie corporations hanging around that shouldn't even be there. I think the days of too big to fail banks are over.
Yeah, thank God. It's a scam that's been perpetrated against the working people of the world for far too long, and it's really refreshing to see the problem called out, and it looks like it's going to be approached and hopefully tackled. So, with that, Spectre, do you have any final thoughts you want to throw out there before we close this up?
Yeah, throw your comments in the description below the video here. See which way we want to go here. Like I said, we've got data on a lot of these things, and I'd like to start piecing this together on some of these major institutions and just start knocking some of these out and kind of what I would call an ongoing series of this stuff. Watch the destruction of the old guard happen in real time.
Awesome. Well, you did a fantastic job with this one. I'm sorry I didn't have too much to say, but you had it pretty well put together and covered it very nicely. So I thank you all out there for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please go ahead and hit the thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification, and share the link around. This is a really important presentation here because the monetary system and the finances behind all of this is really at the heart of it, which it really enables the whole corruption and the whole scam to work. So get this out there. Let's expose these criminals, these financial criminals, and like I said, take our country and monetary system back. With that, we are out. We will see you on the next video.